Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is David Hoffman. I'll be the moderator. I wrote a book about nuclear weapons a long time ago. I'm still being called upon, and I'm happy to be here with you all. A couple of things. First of all, I'd just like to say, speaking on behalf of all of us, we want to express our sorrow and anger and a great deal of fear about the violence in Washington last night. We all feel that the violence is uncalled for, should be denounced, and we express our condolences to those who lost loved ones. This doesn't help anyone and runs against all of our values. Now we're going to talk about something that's also pretty awful, nuclear war. And I'd like to ask you all, make sure to turn off your cell phones. Those watching online, I want to mention that in the YouTube chat box, you can pose questions for the audience Q&A part of our discussion. And I will also have some kind of gizmo up here with those questions, although it's doubtful whether or not I can actually work it properly. But I'd like to introduce our panel first, and then I'm going to have a very brief word, and then I'm going to turn it over to them most of the time. So first of all, on my far right here, Alexandra Bell is the president and CEO of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and she's a nuclear policy expert and a former diplomat. That means she was at the State Department when I last saw her. And she oversees the Bulletin's publishing programs, management of the doomsday clock, and a growing set of activities around nuclear risk and climate change and disruptive technologies. And I would say I've known Alex for a long time. I think we first crossed paths at Plowshares. Later at the State Department, she's been working these issues for a long time and quite effectively. Corey Hinderstein, Carnegie's Vice President for Studies for International Peace, Carnegie Endowment for National Peace, Vice President for Studies, overseeing technology, international affairs program, nuclear policy program, and the sustainability, climate, and geopolitics program. How you do all that, I don't know. But I also can tell you that Corey and I have crossed paths in many earlier periods. Corey worked at NTI. She also was in the government at NNSA. She's worked on nuclear fuel cycles for a long time, trying to make the world safer. So these are people with great and deep experience, more than I have, so we should have a really great discussion. And Ankit, Panda, our author today, needs no introduction. He's written a really terrific book. He's the Stanton Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for National Peace. And don't hold this against him, but also was a journalist. So with that brief introductions, I'd just like to get us started with a comment. And I, of course, thank Carnegie Endowment very much for letting us have this great space for this conversation today. So, Ankit, we're going to hear from you first about your book. But I'd like to raise an issue with you that I hope you can answer. By all accounts, this is the third big nuclear weapons age. If we look back at the dawn of the first one, the strategist Bernard Brodie wrote a very seminal book that I keep on my shelf and consult periodically to remind me. It was titled The Absolute Weapon. And he said that the atomic bomb would change the world and the nature of warfare forever. He pointed out that in the war that was just completed, World War II, strategic bombing was a great technological advance that had changed the nature of war. The essential change, he wrote, of the atom bomb is not primarily that it will make war more violent, but that it will concentrate the violence in terms of time. A world accustomed to thinking it horrible that wars should last 4 or 5 years is now appalled, he wrote, at the prospect that future wars may last only a few days. So I mention this to point out that the nuclear age has been with us for 80 years. What was true at the outset is still largely true. These are immensely destructive weapons. Nuclear war will be terrifying. And we have seen war scares, détentes, periods of arms control and lack of arms control. And we've seen many, many leaps of technology, MIRVs, thermonuclear weapons, targeting. I could go on. So one could argue that the nuclear age is not 3, but it's really 1. And it's as old as an elderly person human being is today. So my question for you is this: what is really new? How did it come about? And what should we do about it?
Great. Well, thank you so much, David, for that really generous introduction. I'm really happy to have you moderating this conversation today. I've learned a tremendous amount from your work over the years. So I think the question you ask is exactly the right one, because I think you could very reasonably make the argument that, and I think this is true, that even dividing these last 80 years into distinct ages is an artificial thing to do. It's something that we do as sort of historians, analysts, to make sense of the thematic shifts in the world, and that's really what the book is about. Because the core argument is that at some point in the last 5 to 7 years, we can quibble about the exact date, we began to see, I think, the sharp reversal of many positive trends in the broader global nuclear order. You could tell that story, I think, beginning maybe even in the early 2000s. After that period, what Michael Crapon once called the golden era of arms control, which he attributed as the period between 1987, the INF Treaty, and 2002, the US withdrawal from the ABM Treaty. Post that period. But fundamentally, I think what we've seen is that geopolitical relationships between the major powers have manifested in a world that is more primed for major war, as I think we've unfortunately seen in Europe, as I think we were on the cusp of unfortunately seeing just a few weeks ago in South Asia. And as a result of that, nuclear weapons have been thrust back to the forefront of international politics. It's not that they went away after the Cold War ended, it's that they sharply receded. The shadow they cast over international politics fundamentally was less pressing. And I see many people in this room here today who I think devoted many of the last 3 decades to reducing those risks in those particular periods, building or helping at least establish a global nuclear order that looked to be a lot more tenable. We indefinitely extended the Non-Proliferation Treaty, opened for signature a test ban treaty, and broadly reduced the numbers of nuclear weapons in the world, reduced the average yield of every nuclear weapon, primarily in the United States and the Russian Federation. During that period, we went from a world with 70,000 weapons at the height of the Cold War to now about 12,500 to 13,000 weapons. And unfortunately, where we sit today, we see, as I described, sharper geopolitical tensions, rapidly changing technologies across multiple domains. Technological change, of course, being an endemic feature of the world in the 80 years that nuclear weapons have been with us. But today, I would argue that the multiple domains in which we simultaneously are witnessing technological change, the very rapid pace of change with artificial intelligence technologies, cyber weapons, really does introduce new forms of uncertainty. And finally, we are seeing the regression of many of those pillars that we did erect and establish over the last 3 decades. And so that leads us to this place where the catastrophic risk that nuclear weapons continue to pose to mankind are back front and center. And really the purpose for writing this book in the first place is to hopefully expand nuclear literacy here in the United States and around the world. Nuclear weapons in that post-Cold War period became something that a very small coterie of intellectuals and experts built careers around and sought to manage, but they weren't front and center like they once were during the Cold War. And for better or worse, unfortunately for worse, I think nuclear expertise is going to be, once again, I think, essential for managing matters of global peace and security.
Do you think like a whole generation just kind of forgot about the Cold War? Did we have a vacation from it? Why the need to re-energize attention to it?
So again, I think it's the fact that nuclear weapons demand our attention once again in a way that they didn't for those several decades. I think we should want to live in a world where nuclear weapons are something that a very small, strange group of experts handles in quiet, windowless rooms mostly. That was the world we largely enjoyed living in for those decades. I mean, I'll tell you a bit about my origin story in the field, right? I mean, unlike most people my age, I lived in South Asia in the late 1990s. Turns out we saw a couple nuclear tests. We saw a conventional war under the nuclear shadow. And so for me, that sort of sparked a lifelong fascination with many of these questions that I now have the privilege of working and thinking about. But for most of my peers, particularly here in the United States, the formative national security experiences would have been the global war on terror, the 9/11 terror attacks, right? And so that, I think, has seeded essentially a very different way in this country of thinking about the national security challenges, the defense problems that the United States needs to fundamentally consider. And of course, now we are also looking at the resurgence of old problems from the Cold War. You asked me what is new. There's also the resurgence of old problems, right? We are now in an environment where American allies, as they once did during the Cold War, are having increasingly open conversations about procuring nuclear weapons. We're back at a place where we're not necessarily rethinking nuclear deterrence, but we're actually reorienting and refamiliarizing ourselves with nuclear deterrence, with the writings of folks like Brody, Schelling, Jervis, and others, who I think wrote tremendously enduring pieces of work on the fundamental nature of nuclear strategy that bear relevance today, but of course need to be molded and readapted to the contemporary context that we're dealing with.
Just count off on your hand some of the big headline things that are really new here. For example, we hear a lot about these highly maneuverable hyperglide delivery vehicles. We hear, you just mentioned that places like Poland or South Korea are thinking about breaking away from extended deterrence. And we hear that China is building a strategic arsenal to be a peer of the United States and Russia, which would pose an enormous are all these really new things? What else? Count them off for me, some of the really major things that worry you.
Sure, absolutely. So the big one that I sort of identify in the book is really, I think, the decision in China to abandon what has been, I think, decades of continuity in maintaining a lean and effective nuclear force in that country, because that fundamentally introduces a new dynamic among the major powers today, right?
So they're going from 200 warheads
to
minimal deterrence.
By 2035 is the public assessment of the U.S. intelligence community.
How many?
1,500 by the mid-2030s. That represents, I think, a really dramatic shift that puts to test many long-standing shibboleths concerning American nuclear strategy and force sizing. And so we in the United States now have this incredibly interesting debate that arguably opens the aperture wider on our future nuclear strategy and force posture than it has been since arguably the 1960s. How do you deal with a world in which you're not just focused on a relationship of strategic parity and strategic stability with a single great power adversary, the Soviet Union and then Russia, but you're also looking at the arrival of a rising China that has a fundamentally different approach to matters of nuclear weapons, but is now sort of impinging on American security interests and alliances in Asia in a really big way. The other really new thing is that this characterization of this new environment as a two-peer environment, as we sometimes like to call it in Washington, I actually think undersells the severity of the global nuclear environment from the perspective, at least, of the United States. Don't snooze on North Korea, right? They are, in many ways, we used to call China the so-called lesser included case of our Russia deterrence problems. The North Koreans are now, in my opinion, the lesser included case of our China and Russia problems. And so we are in this multipolar nuclear environment where you see these tremendous interlinkages. India and Pakistan, too, are affected by the dynamics between the major powers, I would argue. The Indians are qualitatively adapting to maintaining their unacceptable damage criteria vis-a-vis China as China builds up, which draws a counter-reaction from Pakistan. As we saw at the end of the Biden administration, Pakistan is now building longer-range, larger missiles that are giving concern to the United States. And so you start to see these really interesting kind of linkages that we didn't really see during the Cold War, in my opinion. We have multipolarity. Like after China tests a nuclear weapon in October 1964, the United States is deeply concerned about what that means for our ability to pursue our national goals. But the world today fundamentally looks very different. And I would also just point out that here in Washington, I think it's underappreciated just how constrained the United States actually is in answering these problems that we face in this new nuclear age in the ways that we might have answered them during the Cold War, which was with building up our capabilities, building new weapons. We are not well positioned today to build and deploy new things. And so the answers might have to come in other domains, fundamentally strategy and potentially even grand strategy.
Just one more question before I turn it over. Much of the concern about these weapons has not really been about their use. During the Cold War, we actually feared mistake, miscalculation, misperception as much as a real hot war. And I wonder, does this new nuclear age come with the same danger of error and hair trigger and confusion? And if you add more players, more ambition, faster technology? Are we really heading into a period of even greater danger of not deliberate war, but nuclear weapons as an accidental war?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's something that I keep coming back to in the book, which is that having invented nuclear weapons, mankind is now charged with stewarding their existence longer term, right? I am ultimately not particularly optimistic about the prospects for nuclear disarmament in my lifetime. And so the reason I sort of make this case for nuclear literacy and expertise, both within governments and outside of governments, is that we will ultimately need human beings that I think understand that human fallibility and the intersection of essentially that fallibility with our nuclear enterprises here in the United States, elsewhere, does always leave open the possibility that something will go terribly wrong. We know from the from the Cold War histories here in the United States about the many broken arrows and bent spear incidents where things false alarms where things might have gone horribly wrong. We haven't read those histories from many of the other nuclear states, but those risks have certainly manifested elsewhere. And so, as you pointed out very well, David, we have lived with these catastrophic weapons for basically what is the equivalent of an average American lifespan today. That is not a very long time in the grand scheme of things. And so I try to sort of offer a vision for how, if we are to coexist with nuclear weapons, having cursed ourselves to invent them and invent this absolute weapon, as Brody put it, that will demand, I think, constant stewardship and a constant, I think, sense of humility, that failing to recognize as we, let's say, deploy new technologies that we're all very enthusiastic about today, like artificial intelligence, that we do so in ways that are prudent and sensitive to the possibility that something will get terribly out of hand at some point.
If you've ever used ChatGPT and gotten a hallucinating answer, then I don't think you want it as part of our command and control system. Corey, please, do you have some comments about the book and about this argument?
Sure. Thank you, David. Thank you, Ankit, for writing this. I was really thrilled to read it, and for one key reason, which is, I don't know about you, but I know that for a lot of my career, I've had family, friends, colleagues who don't focus on nuclear, who have no idea what we do or why we do it. And it's hard to explain, right? And I actually think this book is an excellent contribution to family Thanksgivings, holidays, summers at the beach. It's a beach read. Come on, people. But I think if you have a smart and interested and engaged high schooler, a college student who wants to go into some sort of national security or international relations field, a colleague who's not a nuclear expert, maybe they're a regional expert and they want to understand nuclear issues and how it connects. I think the way that this book was written, I really commend you for being both, intellectually credible, forward-leaning, but also understandable. I mean, this book is actually written in English, which is not the way that a lot of us often write. So I strongly encourage it from that perspective. I think also it comes at a really important time, and it's what you two have just been talking about. And David, maybe I'll just pick up on your comment about what's new and add to Ankit, to his discussion of that. I think there are a couple of things that are new. One piece on the China side. I think that the China dynamic is really different than any that we've previously managed. It's not just that we have China as now an additive layer to a dynamic that we already understood. It's that we have China bringing a layer that actually looks fundamentally different than the one that we had been used to managing. So I don't think it's enough to say we now have to manage China like we managed Russia, and because of that, we have an overall increased burden. We're actually, I think for the first time in that 80-year nuclear age, dealing with a soon-to-be, maybe not quite yet, but soon-to-be strategic competitor that is also an economic competitor. And what that means is that our dynamics with China are not just a bilateral strategic relationship, it's also about how we act in the region, how we act in the world, how it ties in with our economic systems. I mean, if you just look at issues like the one that's been in the news over the last few days about how we deal with semiconductors and advanced electronics going to China, that whole conversation is harder because of China as a near-peer strategic competitor, right? So this is actually a dynamic I don't think that we have faced before, and we better be innovative and on top of it. The second piece, and I don't want to steal any of Alex's thunder because I don't know what she's going to say, is that we are facing all of this for the first time in at least a couple of decades without strategic arms control in place, right? We are less than a year from the end of New START. I don't have great hopes that we will continue even with a kind of handshake agreement. It's possible, but it's looking, I'm looking at that pessimistically. But it's not just the end of a particular treaty, it's the end of a process, right? We right now are not in a process of discussing arms control with our major strategic adversary. That means fewer discussions, fewer channels for understanding, for diffusing any misunderstandings. It also means that the next steps of arms control are likely to be harder. And I don't mean to decide what the limit is or what the number is. Those negotiations are always hard, and I leave them to Alex. But more that we've already kind of learned how to do what I would call easy arms control. Strategic systems, simple counting rules, and as hard as it was to negotiate and implement, it's pretty easy compared to what will have to come next if we want to actually talk about, warheads as treaty-limited items. Some people have discussed, a no increase commitment as being an easy arms control. Well, from a verification perspective, that is brutally difficult. And so I think that we are at kind of the end of a stage of arms control, and if we want to go forward, we're going to actually have to grapple with some harder questions. And the last thing I would just say is, we are now post-February 2022, and the dynamics with Russia, the consequences of the dynamics with Russia in the wake of their full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I do think fundamentally change our conversation. So if I were marking the 3 nuclear ages, not necessarily from a technology perspective, and I think the nuanced answer is exactly what Ankit gave you, but I do think that there is a way to say there was kind of everything up until the H-bomb, and here I would want to recognize the passing of Dick Garwin last week, a giant in the field and somebody who did understand these complicated conversations and contributed to them. The end of the Cold War, 9/11, and the invasion of Ukraine. I think it's a moment that will be that catalyzing factor for people who are thinking about this going forward.
Could I put a question to you about what you just said, and then I'll get to Alex. But I'm continually puzzled about how we cope with a building up of China in a time in which China absolutely refuses to come to the table. And I hear in the final months of the Biden administration, the argument by that administration, we don't necessarily need to build up. But I also feel in the background that there are people saying, well, the only choice is to build up, and certainly that's now what we're hearing from the current administration. I wonder, can you parse that for us? Is the only way to get China to the table to compete toe-to-toe? And if it's not the only way, how do we get them to begin a negotiation? Because it seems to me that problem is standing and blocking any of the other things you talked about, what a negotiation might be like. We could spend much more time on once we think it's possible. But they have absolutely refused to come to the table. How do we get them there?
Well, I think there are a couple of things to say here, and I'm sure Alex will have something on this too. One is they haven't actually refused to come to the table. I would argue it hasn't been particularly effective or productive, but we had opportunities, including in the last administration. There was one more senior level discussion. I was in that room. It was frustrating, I would argue, but it was an attempt. And I think part of the challenge is that they do want to come to the table to talk about certain things, and those aren't the things that we've wanted to talk about. So I think there's a mismatch of expectation and interest that we either have to come to the table with fewer preconceived notions about where the conversation can or should go, or understand that if there isn't an actual strategic alignment of outcome, of desired outcome, it doesn't matter if you're at the table, right? You can have what I would kind of call performative negotiations, but the problem isn't that they won't negotiate. The problem is we do not share a common view of what we collectively would want that outcome to look like. And so I think we actually have to work on that first. The second piece I would, on the buildup, yeah, I think what you've identified is an absolutely fundamental kind of tension right now in the system. You know, is there a way to define what we have as enough, kind of full stop, based on, you know, Stratcom, you know, the employment guidance, all of the, you know, classified conversations that go into how many weapons of what type do you need to put on how many targets? There's that conversation. There's a separate conversation, and it shouldn't be separate, but a separate and different conversation about, is there a way that we rethink how nuclear weapons need to function in our defense strategy that would change the answer to that question? James Acton here has been doing a lot of interesting thinking on this. Like, is there a way to describe what we have as enough that is abstracted from the conversation of how many others have, right? And that requires a different view of targeting and strategic posture. Then there's a third piece of it, which is, do we think that our behavior will change the adversary's behavior? So that's a piece of that you're describing, which is we need to build more to show that we can build more, to show that to change their calculation on what kind of posture they can back pressure us into. That's the one that I think is a little bit less tethered to any experience that we have. And again, this is where I think the difference between China and Russia matters. People who would argue that are often going back to the heart of the Cold War, saying, let's just outbuild them. You know, let's outspend them, outbuild them, technology them, out-innovate them. And I don't think that's a bet I would place right now on our ability to do that with China.
Also, it's very, very hard when we don't know what the Chinese thinking is about the question of command and control and launch-ready alert. And I read these ominous statements in the Pentagon's assessment every year that they're getting closer and closer to basically launch on warning or launch under attack. But there is very precious little evidence about how they really think about that. So next, Alex, please, with your great experience and your concerns, please help us understand the book and the answers to some of these questions.
Thanks so much, and thanks for inviting me to be here. I have so many friends in the audience. It's like we're having book club.
I know.
I, at the Bulletin now have access to all sorts of great archival information, and one of the things I came across recently was a speech that Einstein made in '48, where he talked about everyone being aware of the threat, but only a few act accordingly. And fast forward to where we are now, I would make the case that outside of this room, almost no one is aware, and even less acting accordingly. So books like these are critically important at a time like this to help expand the conversation. You could pick this up as a non-nuclear expert and really get an idea of the problems that we're in. And I agree, yes, we are in a new nuclear age. What that age is going to be is entirely dependent on the choices that we're going to make over the coming months and years. So I don't think that we're doomed to a certain outcome here, but I think we have to acknowledge that we're not in a place where we're just continually bringing down numbers, building more structures. We left a lot of questions unanswered. We avoided a lot of questions, and this book really gets into some of the fundamental questions about deterrence, about mutually assured destruction, about damage limitation theory, and that's a conversation that I think has been insular and exclusive. And I think there are a lot of people in the community that were happy about that, to have an internal conversation and not let the riffraff in, because that just complicates things. And I think we're in a position now where we have to get back to a debate and discourse on where we want to go with nuclear weapons now that we're 80 years into this process. And that's really the goal of the Bulletin, is to provide a platform for that discussion and debate. I think in terms of some of the arms control questions that come in here in the discussion so far, I think that there also needs to be an acknowledgement that arms control isn't a living entity. It's a tool, and we use the tool, we don't use the tool. We're in a condition now where we're not using the tool as much. We're not necessarily sure how to use it, but it doesn't mean it's dead, and we need to get out of this sort of black and white conversation. Either we do deterrence or we do arms control. Both are necessary, at least in the short and medium term for how we defend the country. I think with China, and the buildup, there's several layers to the problem, but I would agree with Corey. It's not that they weren't talking. We just weren't finding a way yet to have the kind of deep conversation that we wanted to have. And I think some of that is because we were like, look, we've had 50 years of conversations with the Russians. Why can't we just do this with the Chinese? Well, that was 50 years of work, some of which wasn't really going well. We're in a current period like that again. I think we have to invest the time, and patience is not something that our current sort of media environment or political environment, is willing to give. On the China issue, we did have that meeting. Strangely, most important meeting of China in the Biden administration. I somehow wound up on jury duty on a murder trial. So I actually missed that meeting. But I did get repeated meetings with the Chinese through the P5 conversation that we were having, that we managed to maintain even post further invasion of Ukraine. And it was clear that the Chinese were slowly becoming accustomed to the format, slowly ranging away from their set talking points. But that was a lot of time and investment. Again, something that people haven't necessarily been willing to engage in. But after that meeting that Corey was at and others, in that meeting we said we wanted to talk about space, we wanted to talk about AI, we wanted to talk about launch notifications. They flat out said no. But over the course of the following year, twice they abstained on our space resolutions, both at the UN Security Council and at the First Committee, about strengthening the Outer Space Treaty in response to a potential Russian deployment of a nuclear weapon in space. Russia lobbied hard for China to vote no. They abstained twice. In October of last year, they gave their first launch notification of an ICBM in something like 30 years, a clear indication that they do fundamentally understand the purpose of notifications and why you would do them. A month later, China, through Xi and Biden, did a statement about AI and nuclear launch authority, something that we have been pushing the Russians and the Chinese to do. So even if there was tiny little bits that weren't heavily reported on, we did see progress over the course of the year after engagement on the very things that we wanted to see engagement. Is it enough? Is it are the Chinese actually acting responsibly in terms of the potential risks they're increasing by expanding the arsenal? Absolutely not. Have they answered the question of, and I've said this directly to the Chinese, we can see you building silo fields. We know that they're not windmills. We can see you expanding nuclear launch facilities. We see activities at Lopnor. We see deployments of dual capable missiles. If you are not building up your nuclear arsenal, if you are not changing your general nuclear policies, what are you doing? Help us understand that. And if we're wrong about our suppositions, I was willing to admit that. I don't think we're wrong. And I think that's something that I hope the Trump administration is going to take into account, that it's not going to be as easy as just one meeting and we fix all the problems. And you have to have an empowered diplomatic corps working with the interagency to solve these problems. It's not just going to be one person that can go and sign a deal. You need experts working the problem and working the problem continuously.
Ankit, would you like to respond to both of their comments?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was a lot said that I think really picks up nicely on some of the themes that I get out in the book. I just want to add kind of one observation here about the benefits of having lived through 2 nuclear ages, right? So you asked about what's fundamentally new. I do want to remind people, and in the course of writing this book, I read a lot of history, right? We are fundamentally, as a community and as a human community today, not in the position that our forebears were when they were dealing with these same genre of problems during the Cold War in the 1960s and the 70s in particular. We've had the experience of understanding the conditions under which, let's say, arms control can or cannot manifest, what does and does not work, the political nature of conversations around verification, the kinds of debates that are likely to manifest in answering many of these difficult questions. So the book also tries to walk people through some of that history to sort of indicate that, look, we are not starting from scratch, right? This is not the context in which Einstein and others were reasoning about the effects of these weapons on mankind in the late 40s and 50s. So that's the first thing. The second thing is on China. I think what's really important in this conversation is, of course, the uncertainty about the strategic direction of the choices that China is making, right? Xi Jinping, unlike Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, and others, does not like to give long speeches about nuclear strategy, right? Like Vladimir Putin on March 1st, 2018, showed us a very nice slideshow about all these new wacky nuclear delivery systems that the Russians were building, and he had a very good theory of the case that they translated in English and put up on the Kremlin website the next day. I remember that because I was reading it as it happened.
That was the cruise missile that flew over Mar-a-Lago.
Among other things, right? Nuclear-propelled cruise missile, intercontinental hypersonic boost glide system, autonomous underwater torpedo, take your pick. But with China, I mean, there is this fundamental uncertainty, and of course, analytically, the answer that you come up with to that question, and there are many such answers in Washington, really do stand to steer the ship of the ways in which the United States invests our national resources in answering that question. And I think Corey's exactly right that if you make the choices to build, in particular, to answer some of these questions on a theory of what you think the other guy's doing, that gets you into a place where you end up very quickly in, I think, a three-way arms race. And look, again, going back to history, we were pervasively wrong during the Cold War. We sort of change our mind every 5 years or so about what the Soviets really value, what they're really doing and thinking. You've written about this yourself, and I think that's just really important context to the contemporary debates we're having in Washington. And just one last thing to add, David, to your very good question about what exactly is fundamentally new. So this was a manuscript I finalized before the November 2024 election in this country, but it wasn't difficult to see, and I had the privilege of traveling around the world, talking to many American friends and allies in the course of writing this book, that the big thing that I think is unprecedented in the 80 years that nuclear weapons have existed, nuclear weapons, of course, manifesting in the twilight of the Second World War, the same period during which this US-led world order that we've enjoyed for the last 80 years with its many ups and downs persisted. But now we're fundamentally at a place where in this town, the Overton window on how the United States sees itself and its role in the world is wider open than it has been in the past. We had differences with our allies during the Cold War, don't get me wrong, but we never sort of fundamentally had that question about, do we want to be in the alliances business? And I think that is the conversation that I think is now deeply unsettling globally.
We had a consensus that we did.
We had a consensus that we did, largely.
And you think that's crumbling?
From the perception of, I think, many allied capitals, the US is no longer what it used to be. And I think that is deeply unsettling when we think about the longer-term trajectory of mankind with the bomb, because for better or worse, and I would argue for better, the United States has had this load-bearing function in the global nuclear order. I think, many Americans, I think, have perhaps not been too happy with the cost that we'd have to sort of sustain to ensure that nuclear weapons don't spend.
But they tolerate it. We carried it.
We tolerate it. Yes, we've had this vision that American global leadership does also manifest in the United States taking an active stake in the ways in which nuclear energy diffuses around the world, the ways in which the global nuclear order fundamentally functions to both constrain our friends and our adversaries, and us for that matter. And now if we're fundamentally throwing our hands up and getting out of that business. And again, all of this, I think, was foreseeable from when I was writing the book, which was basically after the start of the Ukraine invasion into mid-2024. This idea that the US might no longer be the country we have been, I think, is fundamentally a big part of the story in the rest of the world. And so I think from this vantage point that we're having this conversation today in Washington, it's really important to sort of understand that this is a really big thing that I think is fundamentally unprecedented. We have not witnessed what the world looks like in a world where nuclear weapons exist, and the United States isn't the kind of power that it has largely chosen to be since 1945.
Well, I hope you're wrong, but you may be right. So I have another question. It's we've talked a lot about China. We just finished telling me something about the United States that's a little bit worrisome. But now I'd like to ask you a question about Russia. It seems to me another aspect of the new nuclear age is that President Putin essentially has shattered the taboo of threatening nuclear use. And in the past 2 or 3 years in Ukraine, made these threats repeatedly. And I get what the taboo was. Nina's book about this was terrific, but I also ask myself, does it matter? I'm curious if you think that this repeated threat suggests that Putin might actually use nuclear weapons if backed into a corner. Do you think that just the taboo itself was just an idle concept? Did it matter? What kind of world, is this part of the new nuclear age? in which people make these threats?
So this is a through current in the book, right? You have loose talk around nuclear weapons broadly increasing. I mean, not just in Russia. You've had kind of overt threat making or signaling or noise, whatever you want to call it, from the United States, from Narendra Modi in India, Kim Jong-un, obviously, in North Korea. But look, I mean, the first thing I would point out is that the entire enterprise of nuclear deterrence rests on the risk that nuclear weapons are actually usable, right? So there has to be the manifestation of what Schelling called that threat that leaves something
The
to
credible
chance.
threat.
The credible threat. And so it is in Russia's interest, and it should be entirely unsurprising that when a nuclear-armed state goes to war in which the interests of a nuclear-armed alliance, i.e. NATO, are implicated, there will be talk and reminders that the nuclear shadow hangs over that crisis. And I think that explains some of what we saw, especially in February and March 2022. But the other reason I would maybe sort of push back slightly on the notion of the taboo around the ways in which we talk about nuclear weapons is that if you really look at the kinds of things we consider to be true taboos in human society, those are not the kinds of things we have panels about, we intellectualize, we have entire extremely well-funded establishments to reason about and sort of ensure that, you know, these so-called taboos are very much sort of taking hold, right? Deterrence does not work that way. We have a tremendously large human enterprise in every country that possesses nuclear weapons to ensure that we are both manifesting the credible threat but mitigating the unnecessary risks of living with these weapons. And which is to say that it is this function that nuclear weapons fundamentally play and the role that nuclear deterrence plays in, I think, affecting relations between states that deeply frustrates the objectives and interests of countries that find themselves living under nuclear deterrence. You know, the chapter in my book about nuclear deterrence uses the Ukraine crisis as a case study and points out that the existence of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence has deeply frustrated both us in the West and Vladimir Putin in Russia. And both sides have, I think, tried to pursue their interests, cognizant of the constraints imposed on them by nuclear deterrence. I would argue the very same thing just played out in South Asia, where India and Pakistan both tried to run risks, recognizing that there are certain red lines that cannot be transgressed. And neither of them is too happy about that particular predicament. And so the taboo, I think, when it fundamentally comes to is this idea that this problem of the third use of nuclear weapons in anger since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if that moment ever does come, because we know that military establishments, of course, plan for these capabilities to be usable, there is the prospect today of, I think, more talk about this idea that nuclear escalation might be more controllable should deterrence ever fail. That, I think, is the really dangerous thing because that sort of takes us into the unknown fundamentally. None of us know what that world looks like. If a nuclear weapon is ever detonated, does that result in a sense of humility that we can no longer do this, that nuclear disarmament is the only answer, or does it result in the flip side where you end up opening the Pandora's box on proliferation and nuclear warfighting? These are the questions we haven't fundamentally answered, as I think Alex pointed out, and I think they are best left unanswered if we recognize that crossing that Rubicon into nuclear use is somewhere none of us should want to go.
Could I ask our other two panelists, do either of you have a different answer? I think Ankit's somewhat sanguine about this, but should we be worried about the breaking of this taboo or not? How did you feel in government when this happened?
I think we should be worried. You know, in the end, I think we should be worried because of Ankit's last point, which is we have a lot of theory about what would happen, and we have no experience. And that kind of uncertainty when you're talking about something with the potentially, you know, catastrophic human impact of nuclear weapons is not. I don't think it's a dynamic that governments, even in their most skilled, have an experience in managing. Being at the Department of Energy during the Ukraine invasion and through the months and years that followed, you know, I remember maybe two anecdotes. One is I was in Europe about 60 days after the Russian action started, and when we were having a robust debate about whether deterrence had failed. This was a group of nuclear people, Americans, French, and British, and the debate was, had deterrence failed in enabling the Russian invasion of Ukraine? I mean, from an intellectual perspective, it was an interesting conversation. It kind of went back and forth. Well, deterrence couldn't have failed because Ukraine was not part of a nuclear alliance, therefore, you know, but there was a lot of discussion about whether deterrence was actually playing a different role. It was playing the role as shield to enable action or activity that a country wanted to do, as opposed to the threat of nuclear use being the thing that had failed. Like, we had not actually threatened nuclear use over an invasion of Ukraine, and therefore Russia did it, and that's not, so from an academic perspective, it was an interesting conversation. From a practical perspective, or from a human perspective, it was horrifying. Because we were watching war play out, and this was before the autumn of 2022, increased crisis over nuclear threats. But what it really highlighted to me is, as much as we have these great thinkers, these deep thinkers, how many times have you already said Schelling's name from this stage, right? How many times do people use that work? I think that the kind of traditional and status quo thinking on deterrence, it dates back to a world that I don't recognize as today's world. And it doesn't mean it's not relevant. I think a lot of it is actually relevant, but it is not instructive necessarily. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to be having that broader conversation. The second thing I would say is that one of the biggest things that scares me about the taboo is not how horrible would it be if a nuclear weapon was used. Of course, we all have to recognize it would be horrible. What if it's not as horrible as we think? Russia was threatening to use very low yield and potentially a very low yield weapon in a way that wouldn't have, the Scientific American exchange of 100 weapons, nuclear winter, kind of outcome. If these weapons are seen as more usable, more effective in actual war fighting, then I think that would change and fundamentally change how every nuclear armed state thinks about nuclear weapons, but also how those who are potential proliferants think about nuclear weapons. And in talking up here, we haven't really talked about proliferation, which I feel like I'm failing my entire community by only saying the word now. So I think it really changes the concept if nuclear weapons are suddenly a usable weapon rather than a weapon of deterrence.
I'll take it back to the idea, is the nuclear taboo about talking about nuclear weapons or threatening nuclear use or actually using nuclear weapons? I can make the case that the taboo against use is quite strong, but the taboo against threatening the use has actually gone up and down over the course of nuclear history. Putin's recent comments have come to light, but it wasn't too long ago that Trump was threatening fire and fury against North Korea. The United States has many times said all options are on the table. I think the implication there is clear. So I think, the rhetoric around it, while it's sort of alarming, has ebbed and flowed over the years. With the Russians, though, it was particularly problematic inside, where they were constantly saying, you're not hearing us, you're not hearing us, you're not listening to us, while simultaneously refusing to sit down and talk. They chose war over talking, which we had been offering, and then we repeatedly offered to talk, and they always came up with a reason why. And so, it's a little hard for them to complain that we aren't hearing their signaling, when I think it was obvious that we were trying to talk through some of these things. At the same time, words matter, and we use terminology and have throughout this conflict things like strategic defeat. I think here that was seen as a clear, usable term. I think in Russia it was read in a very different way because the word strategic has certain implications. So I think we probably, again, have to get back into the habit of talking about careful word choices as you're trying to project policies, views, et cetera, something I think we were very conscious of in the Cold War and became less conscious of it. And I experienced this during the NPR. I see Richard out in the audience, and there was a particular incident where we came across people who were more generalists, who spent less time working about the nuclear issues, and they wanted to change some words that would have been absolutely terrible had they changed them, and they had no idea why. And it's because they didn't spend all of their time thinking through word choices in 18 months in a windowless room, trying to come up with the exact right verbiage. So as Byzantine and archaic as some of our field seems, we probably do need a larger discussion about how we're, making threats, how we're describing deterrence. But that made me, this whole idea made me think of something that I really liked in the book, Ankit. You were talking about nuclear deterrence is, after all, most comfortably discussed in the antiseptic language of defense intellectual jargon, which made me think of Carol Cohn's seminal piece, Sex and Death in the World of Rational Defense Intellectuals. If you haven't read it, you should read it. But you followed by saying, but the terror is the central feature. It is not a bug or deficiency. Nuclear deterrence cannot be neat and antiseptic because it is precisely the possibility of Armageddon, of plunging into the unknown, but assuredly and intolerably painful, that keeps the world humming along. And I think that's a particularly cogent point that we sometimes forget. It is the danger of what could be that has propped up our security structure for so long, and trying to make it sort of neat and antiseptic is sort of against the whole point of deterrence in the first place.
There's a defense mechanism, though, because it makes those of us who have these strange jobs in Washington where we make a living thinking about these things, just able to talk about some fundamentally horrible things day to day, day in and day out. So I think I make that point that nuclear strategists have to be able to sleep at night. And I guess this is part of the way in which we do it, by using that strange terminology. But I really do want to hit home your point about gatekeeping, right? This is a problem in this field that makes it, I think, particularly more difficult for especially like younger folks that want to build careers. There's a lot of jargon. It's very easy to be young in this field and say something that doesn't use the right terminology, calling a ballistic missile a cruise missile, or, getting fission and fusion mixed up. We all learn, and I think it's really important for this community to be a lot more open to bringing those people in as well. So hopefully the book plays a small role in helping somebody young who might be worried about saying the wrong things maybe not feel so, not feel like they can't enter those conversations.
Okay, before we turn to the audience, I'd like to ask all of you one more question about the new nuclear age. And that is this. In my experience, and certainly in my time, I covered the Reagan White House for the Washington Post, and to understand the nuclear confrontation, you needed to understand a few things really well. There was the land-based part of it, the sea-based part of it, the missile part of it. There was command and control. There were a few things, and I think that in the Cold War, the two sides worked really hard to understand each other across these basic things. Now, I feel like the whole universe of that is really growing rapidly beyond our understanding. Now, we worry about delivery vehicles that are, highly maneuverable and fast. We hear about putting nuclear weapons in outer space, despite the fact that there's a treaty against it. We hear about underwater autonomous vehicles that could carry a nuclear. It seems that this simple world that we had, at least understandable, land, sea, and air, command and control, is now really exploding into a new age of which technology is driving really the possibility of rapid and unexpected nuclear conflict. And I just wonder, could you address the hardware?
Yeah, I'll just address this very briefly. I think the big difference between the Cold War and today that I see, and even I think this begins immediately in the post-Cold War period after the first Gulf War, is that we now live in a world where non-nuclear technologies, broadly speaking, implicate the survivability of nuclear command and control and nuclear systems.
What do you mean by non-nuclear, like cyber
attacks? So non-nuclear missiles, cyber weapons, missile defenses, which existed during the Cold War, but as we've just seen with the Golden Dome announcement, we're in this new period of optimism around missile defense technologies. Once again, so what is old is new, but it's new in a different way. And I would also add here that non-nuclear states have the ability to now impinge the direction of nuclear escalation with either, sometimes they might be allied with nuclear states. Many of our allies in the United States are very advanced non-nuclear countries that have the ability to precisely hit many things in countries like North Korea, potentially Russia. And so the complexity here, I think, is a lot bigger, right? Because during the Cold War, with the exception of anti-submarine warfare and maybe some air-to-air engagements, it was really only nuclear weapons that could threaten the survivability of nuclear forces, centrally, right? And so in a way that it wasn't easy, but it made the universe of things that you were talking about as an American and a Soviet arms controller or nuclear strategist much easier to kind of wrap your head around. And this also, I think, gets back to Corey's earlier point about the way in which we have to think about the China problem, right? You need sort of this multidisciplinary, broader picture expertise to understand the ways in which all of these things kind of wrap and sort of tie together today. But you can also see how this makes things like arms control just a lot more challenging, right? Imagine negotiating the INF Treaty in 1987, which limited ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles of a certain range, in a world where it's not just the US and the Soviet Union, but you have a bunch of smaller countries around the world with missiles in precisely those categories that are growing bigger and bigger today. That is the world we now live in, right? And it is extremely difficult in that environment to imagine doing arms control in precisely the way we did in the past. And so I sort of make the case that we need to sort of open our minds to sort of thinking about arms control and even questions of verification with sort of new modalities fundamentally. So.
Yeah, I mean, I might just say that I think that the other thing that makes things more complicated is precisely the age of the infrastructures and the systems in these countries. So it's not just what modernization means, it's that modernization actually means something different for each of the countries with nuclear weapons. And having been at NNSA, I can explain in chapter and verse on why our modernization doesn't look anything, it is not, we're using the same word to mean something fundamentally different on what we're doing in the United States versus what Russia's doing with these novel and disruptive delivery vehicles, what China's doing with a massive numerical buildup. But and I think that's important. I think those distinctions are important, and I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A if people want. But I think the important thing is the vast majority of the world doesn't know the difference, doesn't see the difference, and might not care about the difference.
Well, I do. Do you? I do. We ought to, right?
I think we ought to. I mean, I think because I think it puts us, it runs the risk of actually taking something that is, it's another one of these defense mechanisms, right? We take something that is so complicated that we have to simplify it towards something that we can describe. And because if we can describe it, then maybe we can, get our own heads around it and think about solutions. But what we actually have, in the United States, the best comparison that I can make is it's like having a car, and the car's been sitting there for somewhere between 30 and 50 years. And you have to make sure that when you go to turn it on, it turns on, but you can never turn it on, right? And by the way, in the meantime, we've invented seatbelts, and we've invented airbags, and we've invented, cameras that can sense collisions, and we've invented all these things that would make that thing safer, but we have to put all those things in and still never turn on the car. From a technical perspective, that's really complicated, and unfortunately, as we are all learning as taxpayers, it's expensive, especially when you shut down all of the automobile factories, right? So you have to build the factory, create the tool, create the mission, and then do the fix, and also never turn on the car to see if you were right. And by the way, don't get me wrong, I don't want to turn the car on. We have no reason. The other thing that we've done in the meantime is invented a whole lot of great tools, technologies, and science to make sure that we know what's going to happen without turning the car on, in this case, without ever, exploding a nuclear weapon. And so I do think that when we talk about these issues, this is kind of what we were saying before, is it gets really nerdy really fast. And for those of us who pay attention on a daily basis, that's what makes it, that's where those nuances are important. But we have to figure out how to talk to the rest of the world about it.
I agree with that, but I also feel that the complacency that Ankit writes about this is dangerous, because we lose sight of how technology is driving this toward more danger. I feel like the American people and the world itself need to get away from this vacation and focus on some of these specific things. Otherwise, it'll be even more dangerous when we finally wake up.
Yeah. Well, what I was just going to say to conclude and turn over to Alex is, I think the key is not everybody needs to understand every piece of this, but more people need to understand it than do. And I would put a huge burden right now on the Congress. Right now we have, Ankit used this term, nuclear illiteracy. We have a profoundly illiterate Congress when it comes to nuclear issues. Everything from strategy to technology to infrastructure to human capital to science to everything. And I think that when we had senators in the 80s who understood, the thinking behind all of the issues related to nuclear posture and the nuclear infrastructure, we had the kind of oversight that I think actually behooves us as Americans. And I think that if there would be some key people in the Congress who would be able to lean more forward and basically say, it is our responsibility as national security leaders in a co-equal branch of government, question mark, then we have a responsibility to get smarter on this.
I think we could have a whole panel just on the tech implications on strategic stability, but I think in shorthand, new and emerging technologies are going to increase the nuclear threat, but they're also going to provide solutions to reducing the nuclear threat. And I think being able to hold those two truisms in your brain at the same time is going to be the key. I think Washington has a habit of seeing a new problem and creating an office for it and thinking, well, we've got the office working on that. That's not going to work here. Emerging technologies, AI, this is a fundamental change in the security environment. Everyone working on these issues is going to need to be generally more aware of these thoughts, and not everybody, I agree, Corey, has to be an expert on everything, but we need to make sure there's general working levels of knowledge, and we need to make sure that the right people are in the room discussing these issues, and particularly because the nuclear community has been rather insular, it's sort of incumbent upon us, I think, to bring those people in and to also educate people who are focusing on emerging tech to the issues that we're seeing. And I think fundamentally one of those places is going to be the expanded interest in civil nuclear technology, potentially to help power AI data centers, et cetera. That's a necessary conversation that needs to be had about the potential proliferation risks of expanded use of civil nuclear technology. And it's not to scare anyone, it's simply to make sure that they're aware that small modular reactors on every corner has security risks. As well as technical risks that we could go into. But we need to widen the conversation, and we need to not be necessarily thinking this is only a bad thing or only a good thing. It's going to be both, just like most things in the space, and we just need to be prepared to deal with complex problems.
Terrific. Well, now we have a good chunk of time for questions from the audience, and I've got 3 or 4 also from online, so I'm going to alternate. So let's start with the audience. Identify yourself and pose your question for any of us, but preferably our 3 panelists. Joe, please.
Thank you very much for a great discussion. And it looks like I have to buy this book. This is so good job.
Tell us who you are.
Oh, I'm Joe Sorrentioni. I'm spent a lot of time on nuclear policy, including here at the Carnegie Endowment.
And written a few good books about it.
I have, which didn't change policy at all, which is what I want to talk to you about. So it seems to me that one of the characteristics of this new nuclear age is that Republicans are no longer interested in arms control. So the politics of this have changed. We don't have a Richard Lugar, a Chuck Hagel, or for that matter, a Henry Kissinger, a Richard Nixon, an H.W. Bush, people who cared. And this matters because most of the instruments and even institutions of the arms control regime were created, negotiated, ratified by Republicans. Democrats can't do this alone. So what does that mean for possibilities of creating instruments, arrangements, agreements that could reduce the nuclear threat over the next decade?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. That's an important question. I mean, I often like to tell people that I don't fancy myself a sophisticated observer of American domestic politics, despite living in Capitol Hill. It just seems perplexing to me in many ways. But the one point I'd make in sort of answering your question is that I think we've just been reminded in the last 10 years or so how quickly politics in this country can change. And I think if we look at the history of the Cold War period, the post-Cold War period, even when it comes to matters of national security where our core national interests start to get implicated. And if I'm right about this hypothesis that today, from where I'm sitting, and from for reasons that Corey's talked about, I think the United States, for reasons of our defense industrial base, our nuclear enterprise, we are just not the country we were during the Cold War, right? And so the answer today cannot be, it doesn't matter where you sit in our national debates about nuclear strategy. You can be a hawk or a dove, but you have to account for some fundamental realities that we face today in this country, in our ability to build things, for instance. I think that is going to contour the way in which we're going to have to think about our national interests going forward. And so my hope is that once that reality sinks in, which again, I think is a matter of literacy on the Hill largely, we get to a point where we have that tough national conversation and we discover why, for deeply seated reasons of the American national interest, regardless of where you are, regardless of whether you're an America firster or you're a liberal internationalist, you will have to rely on this tool of arms control to answer some of those questions. And again, it is a tool, right? It is not an end in itself. It is a tool that we use to advance our interests. And I think the way in which you framed your question is a really important reminder that in the past, it has been national security Republicans who have relied on that tool to advance American national interests as they've seen it.
Good. Now, I'd just like to take a question from online, then I'll come back to the audience. And there are two questions here I'm going to put together for you, okay? The first one is, what pressures do emerging technologies place on deterrence in South Asia? And secondly, is it concerning to you that China has not had the kind of crisis experience that the United States and Soviet Union had, let's say, during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Can you address both of those points?
Yeah, why don't I take the South Asia one, and maybe, Alex, do you want to do the China one? Just so I'm not the only one talking. On South Asia, so look, looking at this most recent crisis, okay, so first of all, both India and Pakistan are modernizing their nuclear forces and their conventional forces. That is happening. Both countries are procuring new air platforms, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance systems. One of the lessons I take away from this recent crisis between the two countries, which, by the way, was the most intense multimodal warfighting we've seen between two nuclear-armed adversaries in history, right? That's just worth stating up front. We have never seen wide-scale aerial drone warfare backstopped by mortar exchanges, artillery exchanges, short-range ballistic missiles between nuclear adversaries. The reason that I think we saw the level of violence that we did, and in particular, I would argue India's confidence in feeling like it would not transgress certain very well-known Pakistani red lines that could implicate nuclear weapons, was largely, I think, a consequence of precision weapons, right? This precision revolution that we sort of have been talking about in some form or another since the first Gulf War more than 35 years ago, has now really started to show itself in modern warfare. And so I tend to do a lot of work on kind of the proliferation of missile technologies, and one of the things I worry about is as countries and as military establishments feel more confident in their ability to pick targets and precisely hit those targets and not hit anything other than those targets that they don't mean to hit, the kind of unintended, inadvertent escalation scenarios we used to worry about in the past, perhaps you do end up in a world where the idea of throwing punches between nuclear-armed neighbors and nuclear-armed adversaries is no longer as unthinkable as it was. I mean, to give you another example, this isn't just an India-Pakistan problem. I mean, in the United States, there's a growing degree of concern, including from the Strategic Posture Commission a few years ago, about precision strikes on the US homeland with long-range intercontinental systems. That was a problem we didn't think about during the Cold War because the Soviet Union didn't have precise intercontinental conventional ballistic missiles that could pinpoint, hit a target in the homeland. If those kinds of capabilities proliferate today, that does have implications for the kinds of scenarios that we can rely on nuclear deterrence to prevent. So hopefully that answers that question.
Good. Alex, you want to take the China part?
Yeah, sure. In my experience, the Chinese absolutely hate us bringing up the Cuban Missile Crisis. They constantly say that the U.S. has to stop having Cold War thinking. Never really got what they're talking about. I was like, we should stop being informed by our history that we hopefully think is helpful. I hope we're not in a situation where we have to have that kind of experience with the Chinese. That's what we want to avoid, because countries that don't understand each other are more likely to do something stupid. And that's the message that we had been trying to get to the Chinese. Whether or not that was sinking in, it's unclear. And again, I think if the new administration is not pushing to continually try to get the Chinese to the table to talk through some of these threat perceptions that we could be in for a crisis. I will say in response to the last question, though, about where political parties are on these issues, I would say we're kind of in a transitional period because you have a president currently in office who clearly seems to care deeply about the nuclear threat. He brought it up almost immediately upon taking office, has referenced several times the dangers of arms racing, the dangers of nuclear war, which he considers to be our biggest existential threat. So maybe there is an opportunity to potentially shift a little bit. And I think about something I saw on the Bulletin site as I was coming on board, And it said, we only have one bias, and that's we're completely and totally against the extinction of the human race. And I think that's a good way to think about it and try to move this conversation back over to a bipartisan conversation where there's an acknowledgement that there's no single elegant solution to any of these problems, and that we have to consider various tools and techniques to manage these threats, but it is in all of our interest to use all the tools available to us to protect the American public, to protect the world.
Okay, now back to the room. I think you were next, please.
Thank you, everyone, for this great book talk. I did buy the book already, and I skipped forward to the section where you talked a little bit about South Asia. So this is a question for Ankit. Oh, sorry, Nomsa Ndongwe, Research Fellow at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. Also a former diplomat. So Ankit, as a former journalist with South Asian background, what do you wish, so this is two-pronged. One is for mainstream media, but the other is for young professionals who want to get in the field. What do you wish they would do better when it comes to this topic? Were there examples in the recent India-Pakistan exchanges that made you think, dear blah, blah, please read my book?
So it's funny because I went back and I reread the closing section of my own book when the India-Pakistan crisis played out, and the way and this is a spoiler I suppose, but the way I ended up was basically that it's very easy to sleep on India and Pakistan until they have a crisis, which is usually what happens here in Washington. Normally I'll go about my day, I'll get questions about Russia, China, artificial intelligence. Nobody wants to talk about India and Pakistan until they're throwing punches at each other, and that's just too late. Because it's sort of this issue that sort of simmers under the surface, that crops up inevitably over and over as the catalysts for the crises between the two countries remain fundamentally unsolved. Terrorist attacks against India, the territorial dispute in Kashmir, fundamentally political disagreements between the two of them. And then there's sort of the flip side, which is that when everybody does become seized of India and Pakistan, it's very easy to, I think, tell a story about nuclear risks in South Asia that's sort of 10 to 15 years out of date, which is, don't get me wrong, there are nuclear risks, but India and Pakistan are now more than 25 years into their coexistence as nuclear-armed neighbors. They have certain rules of the road. They have a sense of each other's red lines, which is why I would actually argue that the kind of escalation we're seeing today is largely a consequence of that nuclear learning that's taken place. Both sides sort of recognize what the red lines are, how nuclear deterrence begins to frustrate them. So there's a need to sort of really kind of do your reading and kind of understand what has meaningfully changed. The conventional military modernization I talked about is also really slept on. Again, it gets back to the role of non-nuclear technologies in this new nuclear age, right? Both of them have nuclear weapons, but fundamentally what enables the kind of really remarkable warfighting we saw was not nuclear weapons, it was everything else under the nuclear shadow that both countries have been investing in to essentially plan for these types of scenarios. So my closing, my bottom line here is, we can't afford to sleep on India and Pakistan, right? This is a place where the danger of nuclear escalation does remain, even though the nature of that risk has changed over the last 10 to 15 years. The fundamental political conditions remain really dangerous. But unfortunately, just looking at how the mainstream press in the US at least covered it, I remember watching this live, both countries had announced an airspace closure, which to me as an analyst imminently says they're about to start firing missiles at each other or using large-scale air power. And I went to the homepages of all the major American newspapers. There wasn't a single story above the fold about India and Pakistan, as both nuclear-armed countries had announced airspace closures in preparation for major-scale use of ordnance against the other. That to me is just a deep failure of our ability to kind of walk and chew gum at the same time, I suppose.
David, could I just add one thing? I think there's another element that is a challenge here in the United States in particular, which is I think we still have, kind of using your words, an out-of-date understanding of the dynamics between the two and of our role with each country individually and with the region collectively. And what I mean by that is, I think there is still a sense that there is a modern a modern player and kind of a backwards player. And the idea that Pakistan is, these are people who are funding terrorism and hiding in huts, and I mean, like, this is just a profoundly, first of all, racist, but also uninformed view of Pakistani strategic development, strategic thinking, and strategic sophistication. Similarly, I think we overestimate our influence. Some people overestimate our influence and space to work with India as somehow that we are their primary partner. And we've seen a much more complicated and nuanced India. I mean, India's relationship with Russia is real and not changing anytime soon. Their relationship with us, while obviously we have this kind of dynamic as these two major large democracies, it's not straightforward. And there are some, I think, here in the Washington strategic community who would argue that in the end, maybe we secretly like India to be as advanced as they are on nuclear capability, and maybe even more so, because after all, most of what they are pointing at is either Pakistan, which we don't care about, or China, and we want them to point at China. And I think all of these conversations complicate our ability to step back and look at the India-Pakistan nuclear dynamic for what it maybe is or how it has and is developing.
So what am I going to tell Coney scholars tomorrow when you're talking about the future in this field and how we can fine-tune that perspective to bring something new?
So the question was how, what to tell a young scholar now. I mean, I think that the answer is really that to be a deep scholar, you need, region-specific specialization and domain-specific specialization, right? The regional and the functional. But it's also to look at, I would encourage any young scholar looking at South Asia or any place else to be willing to look at the world as it is now, and don't listen to people like us who say, well, 25 years ago we tried that and it didn't work. Or when we signed that treaty in 1968, we thought X, right? We actually have to look at the world as it is now. And that doesn't mean that history is meaningless. That history is extremely meaningful. It can be informative, and some of it still plays. But it doesn't play because it's always been that way. It plays when we look at it and we revalidate the assumptions, the understanding, or the thinking that went into it, and then we can use that as the platform to go forward.
Yeah, I would say, in talking to young scholars, exciting is a bad word because this is an incredibly dangerous and challenging time. But there's so much to work through, and we're no longer just the stewards of everything that was built before, and we're just sort of shepherding it along, and eventually we'll get rid of these things and it'll be fine. We've come to an inflection point, and those entering the field now are going to have to take on these challenges, being informed by the past, but not shackled to it, to bring their creativity, their passion, their drive. These problems are enormous and require a much larger discourse and a more diverse discourse. We've made strides over the years of expanding the diversity in this field. We have to continue that. We can't leave huge swaths of our population on the bench as we deal with the literal end of the world as a possibility. So now is the time to get in. And I think we should all be encouraging that as institutions and as a community to help as many people who want to join our island of misfit toys come over as possible.
And I will say there was some really interesting information that was released earlier this week about about the training and education that is seeing as most valued in the workforce, and in particular in thinking through complex multi-domain issues. And speaking as a graduate of a small liberal arts college, it was liberal arts over STEM, because it's the ability to make connections across a lot of these issues and think about issues in that way that employers are seeing more and more valuable. And I would say that those would be, I don't never want to discourage anyone from going into STEM, but there is a value for people who have this kind of multi-domain awareness and the ability to kind of think outside of traditional silos.
Lots of room for foxes and hedgehogs in the field.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. I want to take a few more from inside because the last one, I want to close with the online question, so go ahead, Leah.
Yes, thank you. Edward F., State Department, retired. I have a question about Golden Dome. It seems to me that Golden Dome, at least as it's being presented, is a fundamental rejection of the model of nuclear deterrence we've been living with and trying to get other countries to accept. for a very long time. I mean, why, I know it's early days, but why is there no discussion of this or pushback of this?
So I think the premise of your question is right, that it is a rejection of this idea of the condition of mutual vulnerability, which I would argue is a condition. It exists whether we like it or not as Americans. Turns out we don't like it, so we try to solve it with technology, which I would also point out is what we've largely tried to do, right? A lot of the history of the Cold War isn't that the US and the Soviet Union accepted MAD, as it's popularly known, but that we both sort of took steps to try and remediate that condition to give ourselves greater freedom to compete. But I would argue, I myself have written an article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Sciences pointing out exactly that this is going to be kindling, essentially, for a three-way arms race, because Russia and China are not just going to throw the towel in after 80 years into the nuclear age and say, well, the Americans built a missile defense system, so I guess they get the last laugh. It's going to be, you're going to see an action-reaction cycle as we have in the past. I think I've seen sort of two counter arguments to that. One is that that's old, that's the old Cold War mindset that doesn't have resonance in today's world. I don't agree with that because, again, the fundamental strategic dynamics between offense and defense remain very much important for how we in the United States think about this problem too. I mean, I'll just point out that over the last few years, I do a lot of work on missile defense. I go to more and more meetings where I hear people you might have considered to be hawks on Russia and China express concern about Russian and Chinese missile defenses being built up. And that reminds me a lot of the history I read about the world in which we lived before the ABM Treaty, right? Where we were mutually concerned about each other's missile defenses. Turns out after the Cold War, it was largely us in the United States that we were investing and leading on missile defenses, both in theater and strategic, compared to Russia and China. That is no longer true as well. And then the second piece that I see as the counter-argument is that technology has changed, the economics of space lift have changed. Those are true, but there are still some really knotty questions about scaling up to sort of keep up with a growing ballistic missile threat. You can go back to Paul Nitz's famous criteria on cost effectiveness, where we end up in a world where even if the United States can very cost effectively deploy space-based interceptors or build new platforms, it will be cheaper by the dozen for the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans even to continue keeping pace. So,
and building fractional orbital bombardment systems and ignoring the entire process.
yeah, so technology ultimately is never gonna, in my opinion, pull us out of this condition of mutual vulnerability. It is part of that fundamental frustration that deterrence imposes on us, right? It provides opportunities. It leads us to believe that we've created security for ourselves, but it also does come with some pretty deep costs that I think we try to solve away with sort of technology, which unfortunately is a road to nowhere, in my opinion.
I keep thinking about why you would choose gold, because it's like a pretty malleable metal. Like you would never use that as a defense structure. But I am a little bit worried it is actually, in fact, more about the gold than it is about the dome.
It's also very expensive.
Yes. And what I think we need to make sure of is that people understand the debate that we're having. It's not about, hey, we're going to build this system and it's going to cost this much and this is the timeline, which has largely been the reporting thus far. And we're actually discussing this just before we came on stage. We need to make sure that Congress and the public and the media is aware of all the implications, offense versus defense, the fact that offensive systems are cheaper to build, so where does this process end? The scientific and technical failures of long-range missile defense, that Iron Dome is distinctly trying to get at a different problem that a potentially Golden Dome system is. I once heard a congressperson say that we should move the Missile Defense Agency to the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, and I think that is something that we fundamentally need to discuss as a public, of how many times we've gone down this road and how many times we've repeatedly had to point out all the issues inherent in sort of broad-based missile defense, but do it in a way that acknowledges that there is a desire to find ways to protect the country against rogue threats, against, we should do everything that we can to protect the American public. That's a strong motivator, and that sounds very good. And trying to get people to listen to the whole broad debate is sometimes a complex issue, and people don't necessarily have the time, but that really needs to be our mission, and we've got to have a vigorous discussion, and members of Congress need to be prepared. This isn't going to cost, if they go forward, $125 billion. We already had a senator on the self-proclaimed Golden Dome caucus say this would cost trillions of dollars. Is the American public willing to invest trillions of dollars on a system that is not technically proven or potentially technically feasible?
So we have one more question online, but before I do, if you can, let's make it quick. Go ahead, please.
Carl, oh boy, sorry. I'm Carl, an incoming summer undergraduate fellow at CNS. I wanted to ask about public engagement. You spoke about how sort of the ideal scenario would be if where nuclear issues are reduced enough that they can be managed by a few people in the windowless room. Unfortunately, we're not in that scenario. So how do we sort of start a new era of public outreach and public engagement in those issues beyond just young professionals who are already interested in getting into the field? How do we engage the broader American public?
I have a good idea. Write a book about it.
Part of it, but that seems like a really good one for you, Alice.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think all of us are doing it in our particular capacities. And I think particularly among the people working in the field, the constant struggle is trying to figure out how to pull people into the debate. I think, you know, the Bulletin was started by Einstein and Oppenheimer, who very much could have done a peer-reviewed journal that was very scientifically focused. They chose specifically not to have it be a conversation among scientists. They wanted, in the months following the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to have a broad-based debate about the moral, scientific, technical, economic implications of this new age that we were entering. 80 years later, you know, there have been pros and cons. No use of a nuclear weapon, great. You know, a drawdown of nuclear weapons, great. But we've also done things wrong. We've come dangerously close to the edge, and I think that's a conversation that people are interested in, want to be a part of, aren't necessarily sure how to access it. So whether it's through books that are broadly accessible, programming like, you know, the good work that Carnegie is always doing and making available, or you know, media like the Bulletin or the Washington Post. You know, we're all part of this. I don't think we'll just have like a podcast and then everybody will be interested. But every little bit helps. Oppenheimer, as a movie, that was the first major Hollywood movie in I think 20 years that had nuclear weapons as the focus. That massively expanded the number of people who were talking about it. And I don't want to rely on movies entirely, but you know, every which way we can do it. It's sort of an all of the above strategy.
Yeah.
Carl, you know, the day after was a made-for-television movie, was the second most viewed television broadcast ever at the time it was broadcast. Over 100 million people saw it in 1983. And I think we need another day after. We need that kind of attention.
Yeah. Just the one last thing I would add to this very good question is the world also changes, and I think humans have an inherent fascination with the dangers of the apocalyptic. And it turns out that as we read in the media about nuclear-armed states invading non-nuclear-armed countries, nuclear-armed neighbors using air power against each other, I mean, I just noticed the fascination around these questions is broadly rising. And so I think we are very early into these shifts. Like I said, this has been going on for about 5 to 7 years now. It's mostly been kind of the experts who have been kind of taking stock. Like the title of my book is not the first time the words "the new nuclear age" have appeared in print. There were articles going back to 2019, including some written by my friends and colleagues that make this same argument. The goal, you know, I see a place now where the broader public is starting to now ask more questions. And so there is a demand, I think, for knowledge, especially from younger folks who are looking, you know, if they want to do something meaningful with their lives, maybe they work on climate change, maybe they work on, you know, new renewable sources of energy, or they can work on nuclear weapons, because we will ultimately, as human beings, need talent, need people to steward these technologies into the future, right? Like we said, this has just been one human lifespan that we've lived with the bomb. We have to think about the long run, especially if disarmament does not appear to be on the agenda at the moment. We need people to steward these technologies and to manage these risks.
So one last question, which was asked from online. I think it's a good closing question, which is, what measures can be implemented to enhance global stability in this new nuclear age? In other words, after all this very pessimistic stuff we've laid on you today, what can we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the closing chapter of the book, right? And it's a really big question. The good news is that, you know, not all is lost, right? We've lived through 2 nuclear ages. We've seen what works, what doesn't work. We have tools and modalities that we know can provide value, that we have reduced the number of nuclear weapons. We've understood what forms of verification are politically viable, technologically possible. a lot of that remains enduring, in my opinion. But also, we have new opportunities with technologies. Even though we face more complexity, we find ourselves in a place where I think even working with private industry, we can begin to attenuate some of the sources of concern that I think are manifesting around how these new technologies might affect nuclear deterrence. But more broadly speaking, I think this will require, at the forefront, like the bottom line of our conversation today is, I think, before we do any of that, we need to have leaders, we need to have lawmakers here in the United States, elsewhere, we need to have publics concerned about the risk of nuclear war once again. This is not a problem we solved during the Cold War and tucked away forever, that MAD solved all of the problems with nuclear deterrence. That is just not true. And so the biggest myth that I think we need to bust is that this is a solved problem, because it's far from being solved, and we need people to continue working on this.
Corey?
Yeah, I'll just quote Ankit, which is, he says in his conclusion that outside of the specifics of any given crisis will be the courage of leaders to seek a way out. And I think that's really true. But I would expand that to say it's not just leaders like President Putin and President Trump. It's not just leaders. I mentioned the Congress. I think it's thought leaders. I think it's communicators. It's really good journalists. It's good analysts to give the foundation. And fundamentally, I think it's people who are willing and able to have a conversation that is inclusive rather than exclusive, that brings people in and doesn't gatekeep people out. Because in the end, and I don't mean that any of us do that in kind of intentionally, but I think that what we have to do is we have to raise the specter that nuclear risks are something that everybody has a stake in managing. And how they exercise that is going to vary. If you're a think tank person, you're going to work on it in a certain way. If you're an entertainment person, a certain way. If you're the president of the United States, you have different tools available. But there are ways for everybody, whether it's through civil service, whether it's through a letter to your representatives, whether it's by talking broadly and internationally to counterparts about how the overall increase in strategic risk is affecting your community. My husband is in finance, and he asks me how things are going in different ways because he thinks about how these global systems are affected by uncertainty and lack of confidence. And so I do think there's a role for everybody, but it does take courage because, first of all, it takes courage to confront issues that are frankly really scary for us as humans to think about. And then it takes courage to think about that the fact that you have a role to play and being willing to play it. And in a time when a lot of us are dealing with, kind of challenges and stressors on a daily basis, to think bigger is hard. And I don't blame anybody who doesn't have the emotional or physical energy to do it. But if we don't, as a collective, then we're going to keep stumbling towards danger. And I don't think we want to do that.
I'll also, page 221, when you get around to it, Ankit says,
So many spoilers.
we have to, the centering of the notion that nuclear deterrence cannot be a permanent solution to the problem of large-scale war between powerful countries. Instead, it should be conceived as an effective, if fallible, temporary solve, given the states that possess these weapons and humanity as a whole sufficient time to seek a better world, less primed for interstate conflict. And I think that's a good framing. This is our status quo will not last forever. The further we go down the line, the more days that we live with nuclear weapons, the higher the likelihood that one or many of these will be used. There are 14,000 opportunities for chaos and potentially death on an unimaginable scale all around us. And that is why, part of the reason why the doomsday clock is set at 89 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been. As sort of a wake-up call that we have to acknowledge the risk that we now find ourselves in, but also an acknowledgement that we are capable of solving these problems. We created these problems, so we're fully capable of managing them, of rolling them back. We don't have to know what the end state looks like, what a world without nuclear weapons actually looks like, to not know that that's the goal that we should be persistently seeking. And I know it seems Sisyphean at times, and we're 80 years into this, and it hasn't always worked. But I talk about this all the time. If we stop pushing that rock up the hill, it's just going to roll right over us. So we just have to keep pushing, and hopefully eventually we will get to the end state. But the work itself needs to continue, and part of that work is reading this book and making yourselves aware. I think most of the people in this room are already aware. But tell your friends, bring it up at Thanksgiving, talk to people about this. People need to know, and this is a good way to get up to speed.
Well, thank you to our panel. Thank you to all for coming, everybody online. Thank you, Carnegie. It's been quite exciting, and I'm still pessimistic.
Thank you,
Thank you.
David.
Thanks, Matt, David.